As we stay with this developing story, we speak to SABC News correspondent Alex Cardier, who's in The Hague and joins us live now. Alex, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Let's start with the reaction from the protesters outside.
Well, there was a mixed reaction from the protesters, certainly disappointment from some of the pro-Palestinian protesters, many of which draped in South African flags. Calls for ceasefire now repeatedly echoing here in The Hague. We heard them react, maybe a bit of a delayed reaction because it wasn't immediately clear to them that the court had not called for Israel to cease military operations in Gaza, but also cheers for some of the provisional orders that the court did rule in agreement with South Africa, calling particularly for Israel to prosecute, for example, any incitement to genocide, to ensure its troops were not committing any acts that were in violation of that genocide convention. So certainly cheering on more scrutiny of the state of Israel and its operations in Gaza over the next few weeks, and certainly a real show of support for South Africa's case for the Palestinians in those pro-Palestinian protesters who have now all but cleared away. And about 300 meters down the road with those pro-Israeli protesters also here putting the opposite view to those pro-Palestinian ones.
And Alex, of course, while some are saying that they were waiting to see if there will be an order around the immediate ceasefire, listening to International Relations Minister Naledi Pandor talking about the fact that when she reads this particular judgment, she says, and I'm quoting, Israel will have to halt fighting in Gaza if it wants to adhere to the orders of the court, asking as well, how do you provide aid and water without a ceasefire?
Well, that's certainly the view from the South African International Relations Minister. We've seen that from the International Relations spokespeople as well, making that point very clearly that Israel's actions in Gaza will have to change to comply to this order. Now, I spoke to some legal experts just after the verdict came down, after the ruling came down, and they said, well, if the court wanted to order Israel to stop all military action in Gaza, it would have done so. And so that would be maybe something to nuance what we've heard coming out of the South African delegation. The other point to be made, though, is that this ruling will have an impact on the ground, that access to humanitarian aid will be fundamental in making sure that things change, and that Israeli operations will have to take that into account. That is one aspect. The other thing to point out as well is that the court has ordered Israel to report back in a month on everything it's done to comply with the orders, and that will be a level of accountability that the court will take very seriously, and the court will be wanting to see the proof from Israel that it has changed listening to these court orders today.
And I wonder then, where does that put what we just heard from, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who still maintains that Israel has a right to defend itself?
Well, that was certainly the Israeli defense from the beginning, and they accused the South African delegation of not taking into account the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th, taking into account the fact that 136 people are still being held captive in Gaza in conditions that are unclear, and even the Red Cross can't access these hostages, and that the atrocities committed by Hamas would have amounted to more than enough reason for Israel to have a legitimate right to self-defense. That was certainly the Israeli defense from the beginning. Benjamin Netanyahu repeating these claims, but again, legal experts behind the scenes telling me that the Israeli legal teams and legal advisors in the Israeli government will be aware and very, very conscious of the fact that that 1 month reporting order from the court, from the ICJ behind me, does put a requirement on Israel to be more accountable and to provide more evidence to the International Court of Justice in about a month's time. So it'll certainly be something to be monitoring in the next couple of weeks.
And I wonder then, Alex, what are some of the analysts that you've spoken to then saying about the issue of enforceability, because that's also part of the big issues that the world is watching to see whether or not Israel will indeed adhere to this particular order.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I asked the European Commission's spokesperson for foreign affairs just yesterday what the European Commission's position would be, and he said, well, we support the International Court of Justice, and any of those orders, those legally binding orders, must be respected. We've seen just in the last few moments the Prime Minister of Belgium, Belgium currently holding the European Council presidency, reiterating that point, saying that legally binding orders on the ICJ have to be respected. They will be, beyond the legal pressure, increased political pressure, as you heard from President Ramaphosa has addressed just a few moments ago, that increased political pressure on Israel to cease, if not roll back, its military operations in Gaza, and pressure on Washington, pressure on the United States to maybe reconsider some of its support to Israel, and put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu's government to change some of their course of action in Gaza. And certainly the international community will be monitoring that very, very closely in the days, weeks and months to come.
All right, Alex, thank you so much for that update. That was SABC News correspondent Alex Cardier in The Hague.